Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel and to the fourth video in the series of building videos for the SoarcerEee. This is about the fuselage, construction of the fuselage, but also incorporates the tail feathers, work on the tail feathers, because there is a crossover between how far you get with the construction of the fuselage, where you need in effect part of the tail feathers to help you finish that off. So I've incorporated them both in the same video. So this video will complete the actual construction of the SoarcerEee. I'm not going to do a video on the covering techniques, because that is all dependent on how you're going to cover the model. So we'll discuss that in a later video, but certainly not part of this video. Anyway, without further ado, as per normal, let's go back on the workbench and see how to progress the fuselage. Looking at the fuselage now, the fuselage is designed to be more or less self-jigging, so you don't have to put it in any form of jig on your building board or even pin it down. And the idea behind the design is that the two main components, apart from the fuselage size, you've got a rear former, trailing edge former, and you've got the servo tray, and those interlock like so. Push it in, they interlock there, and then they go into the slots in the fuselage. That means that that is upright and that is upright, they're vertical. And then you let those dry, and then you put the other side on top. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, firstly, I'm going to raise the sides off the bed, mainly because the formers go through by about a 32nd of an inch, half a millimetre, 3/4 of a millimetre. The reason for that is that it makes sure that you will sand those flush with the fuselage sides, and you won't get an indentation in the fuselage side which will show up through the covering film. That'll be nice and flush. But obviously when you push them through, you need to raise them off the building board. Okay, so let's just glue those together. Press that in. It's a nice fit. Now I'm going to apply glue along the sides there, so when it sticks to the fuselage side. And don't forget to do the top and the bottom of the tongues as well, and just press that in place. If you wanted to make doubly sure that everything is square, then by all means get your set square, put that up against there, but you should find that'll be spot on. We're going to leave that to dry now, and when we come back, the operation will be to fit the other side on, or in fact we'll probably put the triangular strip, and I'll explain what that's for when we come to that. Now that the former and the servo tray are glued in place on the fuselage side, we can now start gluing other pieces on. I've brought the fuselage side in on the building board just to make it easier to show you on the camera, and I'm going to be working away from me so that you can see what I'm doing on the camera. So the things we've got to do in the kit, you'll find these pieces, which are the fuselage strengthening pieces for the shoulder of the wing, where it meets the fuselage side. So if I look at it here, the wing seating, then it will go on there like that, in between this former and that former. The other thing I've got to do is, there's some triangular strip wood in your kit, and that goes along the bottom edge of the fuselage, against which the fuselage underside will be glued. And the reason that's there is because when you're sanding, you can sand a nice curve without fear of going through the fuselage sides or the fuselage bottom, because you'll have that triangular bit of wood underneath. Now I'm going to use odd scraps of this triangular stock. You will get full lengths in your kit. And the idea is, if I just position this former in there without gluing it, the idea is it sits in like that on that bottom edge, and we'll glue and pin it all the way front to back, right the way through to the where the front former, the bulkhead motor mount goes there. So we need to, and it will curve round that curve quite easily without too much of an issue. Now you need to do that to both fuselage sides, remembering to make mirror copies. So the best thing I can advise you to do is to place the top of the fuselage side there and place the other fuselage side top pointing the top of the other one. That ensures you'll get mirror images of the fuselage sides. When you glue the shoulder pieces in here, make sure that the top edge is flush with the fuselage edge and butts up against this former here. We're not going to glue this former in yet. And there I've got the two triangular fillets stuck on the bottom edge. With the former and servo tray and the triangular balsa strips glued along with the shoulder doubler, the next job is to join the two fuselage sides together. And I'm only going to use the middle formers, not the rear former or the engine bulkhead. They'll come later. I want to get all the centre section of the fuselage solid and square. So first job is to glue the front former in place, and I'm using Superfatic for this exercise, mainly because I want it to dry fairly quickly, quicker than PVA. So just slot that in place. Now what I'm going to have to do is to raise the fuselage side up a bit, because obviously the tongue for the former pokes through slightly, as I said earlier, through the fuselage sides. So with that in place, I'm just going to apply glue to the edges now of the formers and the servo tray. I can now position the second fuselage side over the top and just line the tongues up with the slots and push down there. That's a good fit. What I'm going to have to do as well is I'm going to have to weight the fuselage down a bit to hold it in one place whilst the glue dries. So I'm just going to move that across and get the weights now. Just prop the fuselage up again. Again, so it's to one side, so it's solid. And then get the weights and just put those on top of the fuselage just to hold it in place whilst the glue dries. Right, so with the glue now dried, the next thing I'm going to do, there's a small piece of balsa like that in the kit. Now that is to provide support for the rear 1/16 of an inch 1.5mm decking. So this needs to go and be behind the wing seat former there, and it needs to go down with its edges level, with its top, level with the fuselage sides, which, as you can see, puts it down below that former by 1/16, 1.5mm. so that when you put the rear sheeting on, that can be pushed down and glued to that, call it a subformer. So I'm going to stick that in place first of all. Next up is the engine bulkhead. I'm going to glue that in place. It doesn't matter which way round it goes. There is no side thrust built into the model. I didn't find it necessary when I built the prototype. Okay, now to hold that in place, I'm going to clamp that and use a couple of offcuts of ply there and there, so that when I clamp it, the clamp jaws don't crush the balsa. Make sure it's nicely pushed back against the fuselage. So the last former to put in place is the rear fuselage former. Let me just turn this round. But we can't put that in place yet, because when we bring that fuselage together, these ends here won't fit together because of the triangular balsa. So what we need to do is cut those back to give us gap. So what you're looking to do is you're looking to draw those, or let me just turn the fuselage around the other way. You're looking to draw the fuselage sides in, so there's the fin's width gap between them. It goes down through the fuselage and goes to the bottom. So we need to cut those triangle pieces out so we can bring our fuselage sides together. And I'm going to use my razor saw to do that. A little bit of trimming here is necessary. There. So they now come together and giving me, if you can just see that there, about the right width for the fin to go in. So with that cut correctly, now I can now stick in or glue in place the rear former. Push it in one side, hold that with my thumb, and there, that's fitting in fine, like that. And once again, I'm going to clamp it in place until that glue dries. And I'm also just going to put my weights on the fuselage just to hold it down square, because the clamps are tended to make the fuselage twist. I just want to jump along to look at the fin, because while the fuselage is drying we can get on with something else, which is constructing the fin. Now the fin is a laminate of the 3/16 balsa with a notch in it, and then you've got two smaller 1/16, and they go either side and provide a lamination there of the balsa for the fin. Now, as I said a little while ago, the fin sits in the fuselage like so. The fuselage sides are closed around it. You've then got your top decking 1/16 on. So therefore these need to sit or be glued to the fin with sufficient gap for them to sit on top of, or not too much gap, to sit on top of the 1/16 decking. So to do that, put a scrap bit of 1/16 on the fuselage, make sure it is touching the workbench, because that's going to be the top surface of the underside sheeting. Put your fin against that 16th and then just rub a pencil line along there. Now that will give you, the pencil line there will give you where this laminate sheeting comes down to. So comes down to about there. So you end up with that being sandwiched by those two. Don't worry about the fact that they will overhang here, because you're going to sand that down later. But that's what you want to try and achieve. Before we stick the underside of the fuselage in place, just go over the bottom of the fuselage with the sanding bar, just to make sure that everything is ready for the glue. What you're looking to do is you can see the laser burn marks on the edge of the balsa here. You're looking to really get rid of that, so you've got nice and level with your triangular fillet there. Right, with those now sanded in place, the first thing I'm going to do is just put a little bit of glue here between where these two will go together, and then just brush I'm using PVA for this. Make sure the glue goes to the outside edge to stick, so the sheeting sticks down all over. Right, now starting from the front, line the fuselage underside up with the front former and the fuselage sides. Just with your fingers feel where the fuselage sides are to the midpoint. When you're happy, pin down. And then pull the sides in where that former, the rear former, again make sure that you lined everything up, pin in place, and then finally the tail. And you should end up with something looking a bit like this. Try and keep the pins right on the edge, so you're pushing the sheeting down, the under sheeting against the side sheeting of the fuselage, and that way you'll get a tight joint, hopefully. With all the pins removed from the fuselage underside, let's turn the fuselage over. Now would be a good time to think about the method of operating the control surfaces, the rudder and the elevator. In other words, the push rods that are going to go backwards and forwards. You could use snakes going down through the fuselage, like this. And letting those exit out of the slots that have been formed in the fuselage side, making sure obviously that you glue the outer of the snakes to the formers. That's absolutely fine. Or you can go down the more traditional route, as I've already put in there, as you can see, of a traditional, in this case, balsa push rod, and I've got the wires, or the threaded wire on the end, and it's been bound with thread to the end of the balsa, both ends there, and I've got a simple Z bend on the front wire. Now the only thing to be aware of is that the fuselage, when we come to the, get in front of the camera, this end here, there's not a lot of room in there. So be careful about the size of push rods that you choose, because they could bind. I haven't had a problem with mine on the previous versions of the Sorcerer that I made, so I don't think it'll be a problem on this one either. Well, I'm hoping it won't be, but no, I'm pretty sure it won't be. So when we look in here, you'll see exactly what I mean. There, you can see now in the back that they're very close together. Actually, that one comes out further, the tail plane there for the elevator. So there is a gap there, but not much of a gap. So you may elect to use, as I say, a snake. If you do use the snakes, then use the lightweight version of the snake, not a heavyweight version, because the less weight you can put in the rear end of the plane, the better. Now, turning the attention to the servo tray that's in the model, that's provided with the kit, that's been cut out to suit 9-gram servos. Now I use these ones here, and these are the Tower Pro metal geared ones. Just see if we can focus in on that. Really nice servos, really cheap as well, but very good. And the cutout has been formed on the basis of that size of servo. There isn't a lot of room side by side in the fuselage, so certainly you would have to cut down the servo arms. There, as you can see, that's been cut down. But once again, it's entirely up to you. What you could do is, instead of having the servos mounted side by side, you can make this hole bigger and actually have one servo here and the other behind it. So in tandem, one there and one here, one arm going out there, one out there, you're giving yourself more room either side. Again, entirely up to you how you do that. Like I say, do that before you fit the top sheeting, because otherwise it can be quite difficult, obviously, to feed your snakes or your push rods through. And now's the time to sheet the rear of the fuselage in, and you'll have the 1/16 sheet to use for that. Remember, this is going to go cross grain, not lengthways grain. So just putting that up against the fuselage at the rear of the trailing edge bulkhead, and I'm just using a pencil now to mark the underside of that sheeting, and there's my pencil mark that I can now cut to. Cut slightly wide of that line. And that's now ready to be stuck in place there. Now remember, on the first part of the top sheeting here, we put in onto the former this sub-former piece, and that's to stick the front edge of this cross sheeting to. But what you'll have to do is you'll have to press and pin down the front edge of the sheeting, because that's going to sit in a bit of a V to match, basically it's to match the dihedral of the wing. And the reason we're doing it this way is because the wing will sit on top of this former here, and in the event of a hard landing which knocks a wing back, because bearing in mind we're on rubber bands, what we don't want is the trailing edge of the wing to dig into a piece of balsa that's higher than it, because it will just damage it. So if we keep that low, if the trailing edge does move, it'll just slide over the top of this sheeting, and that's the reason for that. Plus it looks pretty cool as well. I'm going to use my brush to apply the PVA. And with the fin laminations dry, next thing to do is really put a bit of a profile on the leading edge, just to round it off, not excessively so, take it away from a blunt edge. And now what we can do is we can offer that up to the fuselage with our top deck obviously already in place, and the idea being that we're going to mark a line on the top where we need to cut out for the base of the fin, because it's going to go in the fuselage like that. So if I just mark out where that's going to go, it's going to be roughly there. And now I want to put a centre line in, because my cut line is going to be either side of that centre line. So there's my centre line. I'm just going to draw that down there. And obviously there's the thickness of the fin either side of that. So I'm going to cut just within that line there. So again, just mark that. Now it's important that you get this line or this slot cut straight down the fuselage, because obviously if that's twisting to one side, it's like forcing the rudder on the plane. So I'm going to cut that out now. So when you offer the fin up to the fuselage, you may find that it doesn't go down all of the way there, and that's because the triangular fillet inside the fuselage that we stuck on to the sides and the bottom was stuck to hasn't been cut back far enough. Now you could put the scalpel in there and dig away to do that, or alternatively what you could do is just cut a chamfer down the bottom of the fin, because obviously your triangular fillets are in there at an angle. So if you cut a chamfer on the bottom of the fin, it will sit into that. So I'm just trying mine. Mine isn't too bad. Getting a little bit tight at the front edge, and I can see there that needs a bit of trimming. With that trimmed, you should now find that you've got your fin sitting on top of the fuselage, with the lamination sitting on top of the balsa top deck there quite nicely, without too much of a gap between them, which is great, which is what we want to achieve. Don't stick it in yet, because we're not going to glue this in until we've put the covering on. Now the final bit of fuselage construction is to do with the battery tray, which goes in this front section here. As you can see that it's smaller than this section. That's been done on purpose, because I don't know what size battery you're going to be using. Obviously it's got to be a 3S, but you could be using 1000 milliamp hour, a 1500, a 1300. And obviously its weight will determine its position to give you your C of G. So the best thing to do is to leave this out until such time as you've covered everything, and then determine where your C of G is going to be, and then you can then decide where your battery tray is going to be. You don't want to permanently mount that in. Well, you can do if you want. You can glue it in place. I would advise screwing it in place and mounting it on hardwood blocks glued to the sides of the fuselage. But we'll cover that off later. I'm just going to leave that out for the time being, but I haven't forgotten about it. The battery hatch is in effect in two pieces. It's a perforated cut in the laser cut pieces, and the idea being that you can mount it on the fuselage, glue the rear piece in place, not the front section. When it's dry, just shape the piece to the fuselage, and then finally just cut through there like so. And that's the easiest way I could think of holding the thing together while you sand it. When it comes to the tail feathers, there's very little construction work required. The elevator, or sorry, the tail plane and the rudder have both got slots cut in them, and you'll then cut the coffee stirrers to length and glue them in vertically in those slots. When dry, sand them down to the same surface level as the flying surface they're in. These are being put into the balsa to stop the balsa warping. That's all they're for. So they're in effect anti-warp strips. The next thing you'll need to do is to decide on how you're going to be joining the elevator halves. You've got two elevator halves which sit, when hinged, they'll sit like that on the tail plane. And there's a gap in between the two because obviously these go up and down, and they go down either side of the fuselage. So we have to join them. Now there are various ways to do this, and the traditional way would be bent wire with, say, a 10mm bend up there that goes through like so, and you would then drill holes in to the elevator for these to slot into, and obviously cut a bit of the elevator back there so that eventually it will sit inside the elevator or built into the elevator like that, obviously with the wire on the center line. If you're going to do it that way, be very careful because this isn't over thick, the balsa. So if you're using, say, I can't remember what gauge it is, about 1.6mm thick wire, you haven't got a lot of room to make mistakes when you're drilling the hole, but you can do it. An alternative to that, if you're still using the wire, is to actually cut a slot in the half, the elevator half. So when you cut the slot in there, you can then epoxy the wire in place there. And the way of doing that could well be you put your covering film on your elevator first of all, without obviously cutting the slots in. And then once the covering's in place, you drip epoxy into the hole and then push the torque rod into it. And obviously you need some more epoxy on that part there as well. Another way of joining the two halves together would be to use dowel of the right size. Now, on the face of it, a good old barbecue skewer is the right thickness, because when I line it up with the tailplane, that's great, that's absolutely fine, it's level. So arguably I could just cut back a recess in the leading edge of the tailplane there on both sides, stick the skewer in there, ditto in there, and then I've got a nicely joined together two halves. The problem is that what we've also got to do when we put a jointing piece in place, because the rubber bands go down and over that torque rod area, we need to prevent the rubber bands from stopping the rudder, so the elevator from moving. So if you think about it, the rubber band will come down over that and it may stop that rotating. So we have to put a sleeve on that. So if we used a barbecue skewer, the sort of sleeve we're then going to put on it there, if we then offer that up, that's going to be a lot thicker than the tailplane. As a consequence, it won't be 100% correct, and you may run the risk of it being pushing down below the tailplane. So when this sits on the fuselage, that will have the effect of raising the tail of the tailplane, which we definitely don't want, because that will affect the whole incidence of the main plane, and it'll tend to make, in other words, if you're pointing it up like that, it's tantamount to putting down elevator, up elevator in, which will push the tail down and push the nose up. We don't want that. So, whilst on the face of it, I said a barbecue skewer looks great, it's slightly too thick. A cocktail stick here may well be the answer, because if we get a suitable bit of tubing to fit round that, now they are the same level. And there's sufficient length in a cocktail stick there to give you enough gluing area. If I just put those in place. So it's quite a good surface area between there and there for the cocktail sticks to be glued to there, to the leading edge of the tailplane. Obviously, as I said before, recessed back. At the end of the day, what you've got to provide is some form of mechanical connection between these two halves that doesn't allow twisting. And a cocktail stick is pretty good at that. The other thing to think about is whether you're going to join these two halves together before you cover, or whether you're going to join them after you cover. If you join them together before you cover, then obviously this is, I'm not saying it's fragile, but it's not, you know, you're talking about just this bit of dowel or this cocktail stick holding these two halves together. You could end up breaking it, which you don't particularly want. So it could well be that once you've cut this to suit, you cover these and then afterwards glue, if you're going to do it that way, the cocktail stick in place. So like I say, it's entirely up to you how you do it. There are various options. None of that, the materials for doing that, are provided in the kit. Originally I was going to provide some wire, but I thought, well no, not everybody's going to want to do that, drill hole in their elevator halves, because you run the risk of one being drilled at an angle like so, and the other one being drilled at an angle like that. And when you put the two together, you've got two elevator halves that aren't dead level. So it may be easier if you use like the cocktail stick method of joining them together. Once in place and once you've hinged, it will be perfectly strong enough. That isn't a problem there. The elevator halves should be sanded slightly, just to give them a little bit of profile, but there's no need to sand them to a sharp point there. Just give a little bit of an aerodynamic profile on each half. And obviously the same goes for the rudder as well. You need to sand that to profile. Going back to the elevators, the other thing you have to decide on is how you're going to hinge them. I'm going to top hinge my elevators, which means that I have to sand a bevel on the front edge, obviously to allow the elevator to turn down. It's going to be hinged at the top, so I need to cut that back at about something like a 30-degree angle. If you're not going to do that, if you're going to use mylar type hinges, then obviously you need, like you did with, or like you need to do on the rudder, you'll need to sand something like a 45-degree angle there on it, so that can pivot up and down. Again, your decision. I'm going to stick with the top hinging because I like that. At the end of the day, after I've covered it, I just put a strip of tape on the top and the bottom, and that's the hinging done. Well, that completes the build video, apart from a few odd assembly bits and pieces, which I'll cover in the next video. Anyway, I hope you liked it. As usual, put your likes down below and any comments down below. And if you haven't done already, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.